I'm Laura Camfield from the University of East Anglia, and I've been asked to talk to you today because since my PhD in the early 2000s, I've been working exclusively in an interdisciplinary way, or at least trying to, using mixed methods on two large international projects, both looking at well-being. So I faced quite a lot of the challenges, but also understand the value and importance of this work, particularly as we deal with increasingly complex problems in research and evaluation. So in the last 5 years since joining UEA, my work has been more focused around methodology, and particularly around pedagogies of teaching interdisciplinarity and mixed methods, and thinking about how within research projects you create conditions in which that can best exist. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my experiences, and I'm also going to use the slides, and I'll say advance when I want the slides to move on so they can be synchronized. Which is more to give you a little bit more detail on the work that I'm talking about, as I'll be necessarily brief in this overview. I have to excuse me looking away down at my notes. So the first question I wanted to raise is this question around multi, inter, post, trans, all these different terms, but what do they actually mean? Well, as part of the Q-squared movement, there was quite a good analysis made of the differences between multi and interdisciplinarity. And basically, multidisciplinarity is where you bring multiple disciplines together, but they might not be interacting, they might not be questioning each other's paradigms, they might be working alongside each other, but not really working together. Interdisciplinarity attempts to move beyond that. It attempts to get people engaging quite critically with paradigms held by other disciplines, and also to think about how their own work can be improved, drawing on different examples. Transdisciplinarity is where disciplines is, I think, very similar to interdisciplinarity, where you have researchers working together to solve a common problem. And then post-disciplinarity would be a situation which is often said we've reached within development studies, where people are less strongly attached to their particular disciplines. And actually I think that can be quite problematic, because I think being grounded in a particular discipline, in my case anthropology, gives you a place from which you can speak, from which you can reflect critically on your own practice or launch into a critique of others' work. I mean, it gives you quite an important perspective. So when people talk about interdisciplinary working, it can just mean picking up methods from different disciplines and putting them in a toolkit without really much thought about different disciplinary understandings around ontology, how the world is, epistemology, how we can know about the world, which are obviously very important and shape the methods in which we use, the methods which we use and the ways in which these methods then construct data. I mean, the very notion that methods can construct data indicates that I come from quite a particular ontological and epistemological perspective. So all of these disciplines and these methods have particular intellectual histories, and I think it's very important to understand those in using them, which is why interdisciplinary working is a very good model. If you move to post-disciplinary, then you forget the history, essentially. And I think you can then perhaps head into some problems. There's also a sense in which, within development studies at least, a post-disciplinary vision could be one that's influenced by the strongest actor, which would undoubtedly be development microeconomics. So a post-disciplinary world might be one where we in fact all become economists. I don't feel so comfortable with that. I think that particular disciplines have rich and important contributions that we should draw on. So that's why, although it is challenging to do in practice, I position myself within interdisciplinarity. Then the second thing I would say is that the nature of the problems that we encounter as researchers and as evaluators are increasingly complex and complicated. So if we move on to the next slide, which is a summary of Gluberman and Zimmerman's work around the difference between simple, complex and complicated, we can see that actually very few projects or interventions fall into this first category of simple. These are the so-called low-hanging fruit, the kinds of things the Gates Foundation focuses on. But arguably all these low-hanging fruit have been picked, and what remains now are the truly wicked problems of development, problems which involve comprehensive social change, which may be resisted by many actors, that are quite socially embedded, say female genital mutilation, child marriage, problems about which few agree even that it is a problem, or particularly what the solution would be. And I think also when you look at simple interventions, so mosquito-treated bed nets, something I've always imagined as a paradigmatic simple intervention, but when you know a little bit more about it, you discover that in fact that isn't the case, that even simple interventions have quite complex aspects to them. within the case of bed nets, it's actually very common in fishing communities for fishers to use the nets to do their fishing rather than necessarily to protect their families. I mean, it's obviously a choice that they're making, but it's one that you would need to be aware of in evaluating the successive distribution, and also perhaps a mismatch between the successive distribution and reduction in incidence of malaria. Similarly, with iron tablets, the data has shown it's a great intervention if a single individual gets it, if it's shared across the whole family. If the child is then ill as a result of taking the iron tablets, it tends to be less successful. So my third point would be that in engaging with these increasingly complex problems and emergent problems, I mean, Donald Rumsfeld talking about the known knowns and the unknown unknowns, what we don't know that we don't know. I mean, that seems very much to characterise the state of many interventions and research problems, like the reintegration of child soldiers. It's very new, it's very problematic on a number of levels. In terms of how you actually do it, it's you learn as you go along. Programmes need to be quite flexible and adaptive, and then very detailed in recording what they're doing. So whereas with a simple problem, you can imagine a single discipline might possibly be able to solve it. How do vaccines are proven to work? How do you get the vaccines to the children? Once the children are vaccinated, they're not then vulnerable to particular diseases. Maybe you only need clinicians, nurses, specialists in healthcare distribution, but for more complex and multi-dimensional problems around, say, economic empowerment, then clearly you need a number of different specialisms working together. And this is where we come back to this idea of interdisciplinarity. So my second point would be that disciplines are quite different. We are socialised differently within these disciplines, and we often hold quite different value systems, which are then associated with the approaches that we take. So this question of the place of the individual within anthropology and other disciplines, very, very important. If you have a more quantitative mindset, then you don't get it quite right with an individual questionnaire, but actually it's cancelled out by the large numbers of other questionnaires that you take. So it's not really the individual, it's the average, it's the mean that's the important thing that you're working towards. The place of context as well, is this something that should be controlled for, or is it a valuable object of study and learning in itself? That's definitely a disciplinary difference. And also the way in which you work with participants and colleagues. Is it okay to administer a massive questionnaire to people that takes sort of 4 to 5 hours? Quantitative people say yes it is, qualitative people say no it is, although actually some quantitative people say that there's a clear diminution in data quality as the questionnaire length extends. So obviously there are critical perspectives within different disciplines. I think the final and very fundamental difference is, of course, the extent to which you believe that the data is not collected, but is actually generated through the interactions that produce it. And as an anthropologist or a sociologist or a social scientist, essentially, I think that would be a premise that you would work from, that you need to look very carefully at the instruments that you use and the context in which you collect data to see the ways in which you might be inadvertently constructing the data that you then go on to report. And obviously an awareness of this, and also the way the biases of particular researchers then shape the way in which they analyse their data, is coming into economics and other disciplines. And we see this very much in the increasing advocacy for replication, because few studies, in fact, within psychology and economics can be reliably replicated. I think Ioannidis found that it was about a third, because very particular conditions were in place at the time at which the study was done, which means that it can't necessarily be assumed to be a general phenomenon that's being observed. It could in fact be one constructed by the study itself. So economic replicators have actually found that treasured ideas around the reasons for economic growth in Africa, or the benefits to women of microcredit, when you attempt to replicate them, just don't stand up. And this is a really important insight for programming. So the fourth thing I'd like to talk about would be something that always comes up when you teach on mixed methods, which sounds like a naive question, but it's in fact probably the most fundamental one. Well, what do you do if you get different answers? What if the interviews tell you one thing and the surveys tell you another? I mean, this is actually a very real problem, particularly when you come to present your results to others. And it's probably why, as I'll say later, many studies analyse their data and analyse and present their data separately, or don't analyse some aspects of their data. So I think it's fair to say that policymakers don't necessarily embrace polyvocality. They actually feel that many contradictory voices might reduce the credibility of the evidence rather than increase it. So if you have a kind of action orientation, you want a just so story or some killer facts to base your intervention on, then mixed methods research, which can actually be better at deconstructing these simple stories, is maybe not your ally. It doesn't necessarily give you the information that you need. And that's why we sometimes see an approach in analysis of mixed methods work where the quantitative data is presented as the truth, and then this is illustrated by quotes in text boxes. But there isn't the sort of fundamental challenging of the quantitative data that you might like to see in a genuinely interdisciplinary study. So my fifth point would be around the fundamental hierarchies within teams. Yes, these can be about qualitative and quantitative research, and particularly in terms of how the research budget is allocated, but they can also be about global north, global south. It can be age, gender, ethnicity, even contractual status, and whether you're an early career researcher or someone who's more established. Related to this, of course, are the slightly different incentive structures within research teams, as we see very much when we work in communities and participants clearly have different incentives that cause them to respond in particular ways. They have their own motivations as well, and we need to take that into account. So I think one example in which this is very obvious is the focus on publication in European and US universities, which is very much crystallised around this sort of figure of the ref, which not only requires international publication, but requires very particular forms of publication, ideally single-authored papers in elite single-discipline journals. So the emphasis on focus and specialisation and having a clearly identifiable individual contribution. It's not about everybody who worked on the project being credited on the paper. That's not approved of. It's not about devoting lots of resources to communicating your findings to practitioners and policymakers. I mean, yes, we have an impact agenda, but I think in the end it seems to always come down to high impact factor journals, which are usually single discipline journals rather than the broader journals like development and policy, which practitioners tend to read. So people are obviously, people have different backgrounds, they're motivated by slightly different things. This is something that we need to balance in working with a research team. But what are the kinds of practical strategies that we can use? Well, ideally, integration starts right from the start. So qualitative and quantitative teams are working together on research instruments. But this obviously requires quite a lot of time. It requires mutual respect, understanding, creating a culture in which people can exchange quite freely. And it requires careful thought around the research design to allow sequencing. So there's the harmonisation of the schedule, which means that people have enough time for analysis so that the quantitative data can build on the findings of the qualitative or vice versa. Without that analysis time, this doesn't really happen. And there perhaps also needs to be harmonisation of schedules, so the survey researchers can participate in the earlier qualitative fieldwork and get a sense of what the problems are in a community and the best way to talk about them. But this is, it feels probably like doing everything twice. There's a certain benefit in terms of specialisation in splitting, a time benefit in splitting the different teams and getting them to do different things. But you then lose this holism, this chance for an exchange. So the final area which can be then problematic is writing together. And I'm going to discuss this in relation to a particular case a little bit later on. And the main problem is usually time, because fieldwork always takes longer than anticipated. Data processing always takes longer than anticipated. Usually you've only just finished your fieldwork when your grant has actually run out. So, I mean, when you then come to do the analysis, you work with the data you're familiar with, you work with the colleagues you're familiar with, the approaches you're familiar with. Why would you go beyond your comfort zone? What would be the benefit of doing that? And so it's quite hard to do rigorous interdisciplinary work in a situation where people are already under a considerable amount of pressure. Why would they make their lives more difficult? So one way in which this has sometimes been dealt with is having the same researcher work across both the qualitative and quantitative aspects. And this was very successful in Gibson and Duncan's longitudinal evaluation of the New Hope programme in America. But again, that requires quite particular skills on the part of the researchers. It requires openness, it requires a space in which they can afford to take risks and can actually afford to fail. And it's also probably something you only want to do when you're quite early career. It may be that when you're established as the professor of X, you don't necessarily want to start learning qualitative methods and finding out that actually you're quite bad at them. You want to stick with your econometrics, which you've won awards for doing so superbly well. So it's quite hard to get people to think differently and to create the space in which it's possible for them to do that. Which then brings us to a point around interdisciplinary pedagogy. What do you do if you want to encourage a spirit of interdisciplinarity among the researchers of the future? Well, I would say that critical thinking is absolutely key. It's not easy to teach, but it is possible, getting people to look critically at their own work, to look at others, to engage with published articles, and not to not feel afraid at looking, not think, oh, well, that's by Angus Deaton, how could it possibly be wrong? There are often, history has shown us, there are often small but important errors in analysis and theory that can be identified, and it's important to be thinking critically about these. But there also needs to be a willingness to bridge, to sort of not be deterred by what are actually quite superficial differences in vocabulary and conceptualisation. And perhaps also to bricolage, to draw on best practice in other disciplines, to not think that just because you're a qualitative researcher, it's okay to always do snowball sampling. I mean, maybe representative or stratified representative sampling actually has something to offer in terms of credibility of a research design. Perhaps one of the questions often addressed at focus groups around representativeness could be dealt with if sampling were done more systematically. And this has been tried in other projects, notably by Carlos Barahona. So, also thinking about the way, so this question around sampling, but on the quantitative side, thinking about the way that you treat enumerators. They are also researchers, they are very skilled field workers, and their positionality, their identity, the way they present themselves, the language they use, constructs the data in the same way that a qualitative researcher does. Even if they have tablets, they're still engaging in this kind of social process. And I think this awareness should inform the way that we look at household survey data as well as interview data, because it's all about people speaking to other people, and then that being recorded, whether it's in a tablet or longhand or audio recorded. Essentially, it's data produced through human interaction and therefore fallible in very similar ways. I think treating enumerators as data collection machines is a very big mistake, and we can see that as survey researchers when we look at the systematic variations between the data collected by one individual versus that collected by another. So in terms of how you then train researchers, obviously exposing them to the best of other disciplines, the best writings, people who can come and speak very powerfully about what economics or aspect of natural resources or anthropology can bring to the world and the different perspectives on different topics. That can be quite exciting. But you also need perhaps to have assessment strategies that reward this interdisciplinary working, because it does take more effort. So something that's been suggested among established researchers to reduce bias is to have a sort of adversarial approach. You could have have two people working together who are not actually from similar schools of thought, but by having them working together, they're constantly challenging each other's ideas and collectively moving to something that feels a lot more sound. But I think that's a final thing to say about interdisciplinarity would be that whilst whilst this world that I cannot say interdisciplinarity is the best way to tackle our complex reality. I mean, it does reflect how the world is. It probably doesn't reflect the reality of how research is currently constructed. It feels more like an ideal which we continue to work towards rather than a reality. And if we sort of move the slides on to look at the case study of a very good project which is carried out in Nigeria, India and Uganda, we see that some of the problems that I've already mentioned around integrating the data in analysis and different rewards for different styles of writing come out quite strongly here. This is a very good project. It's a very good example of interdisciplinary working, but it wasn't wholly successful in achieving its goals for the reasons that are outlined here. And my own work as part of an evaluation of about nearly 10 years of a particular research project funded by 2 international funders found that of about 120 studies, these kinds of problems were all too common. This example very much illustrates the types of challenges where you find little evidence of sequencing, of integration in publication. I mean, these are key. I would say these are key indicators of whether mixed methods work is being done well or badly. And it's something that Kitty Rowland and I explore in our edited volume that's recently been published. Also, archiving. If you're only archiving your quantitative data sets and not your qualitative data sets, what does that say about the status of qualitative data within your project? So I think these are important things that need to be looked at. In general, interdisciplinary working, mixed methods, are not being done well, even in areas where you would expect them to be being done well. And as someone who does try to do this kind of work, I can say I very much understand why that might be the case. And so it's clearly important that initiatives like Aura work with the future generation of researchers to build understandings that will enable them to carry forward this challenging form of practice in their own research and their own teaching of students.